There is more talk than probably ever before in history about this idea of trauma, generational trauma, the trauma people experience. And we're getting better at understanding the implications, the effects of people who have endured trauma in their life. One of the areas in which that can manifest is money, personal finance. And so, some people look at their behavior and say, why am I like that? Why am I like that? Oh, interesting. You're someone who's experienced trauma. So while the research is relatively new, while the engagement from our mental health practitioners is relatively new, there is lots of really great work that's illuminating the connections and illuminating some of the ways in which humans can process the trauma to improve their life overall, but improve their outcomes in money as well. And that's the focus of our next conversation. Chantel Chapman is CEO and founder of the Trauma of Money Institute, and she joins us today from Tsawwassen, British Columbia, to talk about her work. Hello there.
Hi, thank you for having me.
As I mentioned, trauma was not something that we talked all that much about. Certainly a decade ago, we haven't talked about it regarding money very much at all. And here we are all the way in 2026. What was your entry into this world of thinking about and engaging on the question of what role does trauma play as it relates to money?
Yeah, so my background is in finance. I've worked as a financial professional for about 20 years. And part of my journey working as a financial professional is I had a financial literacy education business where I was teaching very traditional financial literacy. I was doing some consulting in the fintech space around education, consumer advocacy, etc. And I knew the do this, you're good with money, do that, you're not so good with money, financial literacy education. But even within myself, I noticed that I had some behaviors that were sticking around money
Mm.
that were very, very hard to change. And through my own journey of my own trauma healing, I started working with a trauma therapist and I started to identify some specific behaviors I had around money that I believed were linked to trauma. And in the first time after working with a trauma therapist for years that I brought up this connection, it was very interesting. There was a very tangible shift in the energy of my therapist where she pulled back and she went into financial literacy mode with me. Have you tried budgeting? Can we break down these steps into like tiny, accessible little tasks? I'm like, no, I think I want to unpack something a little deeper here. I want to unpack something about power dynamics and growing up in poverty and attachment trauma. And through this exploration, it became very clear that the therapist was not trained in supporting folks around money.
Mm.
And so I started asking around and doing some research within the therapy community. And when I brought it up, there was a really interesting response. No, but I would love this. I have my
Right. What a
own
great
mistakes with
idea.
money. Yes, what a great idea. And so at that point, I partnered with a trauma therapist and we started testing some workshops. I brought in the behavioral finance, the financial education, and a little bit of the research that I had done on my own journey, just looking at the intersection between trauma, money, and power dynamics. And so we ran some workshops
Mm.
and they were so successful that we decided to develop a curriculum and bring in psychologists and therapists and
Mm.
experts who work in social justice and community economic development. We gathered, we created this curriculum, and we launched it 6 years ago to
Wow.
train the therapist and the financial professionals in this approach that looks at not just like someone's individual trauma experiences
Yeah.
around money, but also like contextualizing some of the responses that people are having around money and what influences their behaviors within the larger looking at the dominant
Yeah.
economic system in which we live
Can
in.
you give us some examples of what that might look like for people? So to your original therapist, she had a hard time connecting those two things. It was like, no, no, how about we get you an app and then you can manage your spending. So in your context, you now have much more awareness about these connections. And I'm sure when you hear people speak, you're like, okay, it is abundantly clear there is a connection. So can you give us some examples of some of those connections?
Yeah, absolutely. So for me personally, in my own lived experience, I had a manifestation of behaviors that now we identify fall under this term that we have coined in the Trauma of Money Institute called financial fawning. And it's a set essentially where I will use like all resources that I have available to me, such as time, money, etc., to basically prevent people from abandoning me and
Hmm.
seek acceptance. So that means that I would abandon myself. I would people please with my money. I would overgive. I had no boundaries. I couldn't negotiate. I was under earning. And at the end of the day, when you have this very overdeveloped sense of responsibility and you're seeking this attachment and belonging so strongly, you're abandoning yourself, which means you will naturally fall into a place of financial avoidance.
Mm.
So your own taxes are not going to get done on time. Your own bookkeeping is not going to get done on time because you're exhausted from the external caretaking. So that was for me the biggest one. But there are so many ways that we see this show up, and it's income agnostic. We see this at all levels of wealth and income. And it can show up through financial avoidance, subconscious rejection of money, using money to control, financial enmeshment. So, like, really blurred boundaries between different folks and family dynamics. We can see this through like consistent dopamine seeking behavior. So, compulsive spending, excessive risk aversion, so many ways this shows up.
It reminds me of a woman I worked with years ago who was talking about being raised in poverty and by a single mom for whom money was evil. Anybody who had it was a bad person. So you did not want to be a person with money because that meant you were a bad person. And as a successful entrepreneur, she just couldn't keep a handle on her money. She overspent, she gave it away, she did everything she could to almost sabotage the success of her business and her financial life in order to fit with this narrative that her upbringing had created. And that connection she'd never made that connection. She just thought she was, bad at budgeting.
Yeah, yeah, that's a huge one. And in my office here, I have some artwork on my wall, and one of the pieces say you can be trusted with money.
Yeah.
And this is a new generative belief that we work with for folks who have had that experience where they've conflated money with like evil and bad, or maybe extraction and exploitation, and then they end up like consciously or subconsciously rejecting it. And so, yeah, this is something we see a lot, and we see it at all income levels.
Can you talk a bit more about some of the other things that your curriculum covers? What are the ideas that kind of capture or catalyze insight for participants to illuminate what they might be dealing with themselves?
Yeah, yeah. So we usually start off with exploring financial shame and how financial shame manifests, and how to work with financial shame. That's always a really good place to start because shame can even get in the way of working through chronic stress or trauma. And then we have a trauma of money map, which explores the 6 layers that impact the relationship with money, which goes through generational trauma and scarcity, relational trauma and scarcity, societal trauma and scarcity, systemic trauma and scarcity. We always say trauma and scarcity because one of the modules that we teach is the psychology of scarcity. And scarcity is really fascinating because when we started mapping how scarcity impacts the brain, it's identical to a trauma response.
Hmm.
And it makes a lot of sense because our brains are predictor machines. So what our brain is doing is it's taking all experiences and it's using that information to predict what to do to allocate resources and conserve energy in the body, right? For your survival and thriving. And so there's so many instances that we work with where someone may have not even experienced financial scarcity in their life, but it was in the generational line. And their brain is predicting that they need to interact with it through the lens of scarcity. And we
Hmm.
know that scarcity reduces cognitive functioning. It increases the chances that you're more likely to act out on temptation. And it just all overall
Hmm.
creates this bandwidth tax.
How do you define the word trauma? And I ask because I think in our culture today, some people would say, well, I wasn't abused as a child. So
Yeah.
therefore, I mean, this is interesting, lovely conversation you're having, Bruce and Chantel, but it doesn't apply to me. How do
Yeah.
you define the word such that people may be able to see themselves in what you're talking about?
Yeah. This is so controversial, and a lot of people can get very stuck on the word trauma. And we really like to approach it from the lens of neuroscience and looking at the brain in the way that I just described is your brain is a prediction machine. And so if you've had stressful experiences in the past, your brain is going to be using that to predict ways to keep you safe and help you survive. Now, the way we look at trauma is it's when something happens that impacts your sense of security and worthiness, and it's quite significant that your brain needs to hold on to that to protect you in the future. And now, when you use a definition like this, it can be it can be abuse, it can be war, and it can also be tiny experiences that you've experienced often that add up. And this is where we look at like small T trauma versus big T trauma that can have an impact on you. And so we use the word trauma, but then we unpack it deeper from more of a neuroscience lens to make it a little bit more accessible. And then by looking at the manifestations of trauma within our dominant economic culture, you can start to identify that, oh, wow, if you look at the American Economics Association's website and the way that they define the word economics, they say economics is the management of scarcity. We look at what scarcity does to the brain and we see it creates a trauma response. Just by living in a system that is built on scarcity, the brain is adjusting in a way for your survival. So based on that argument, it's hard to encounter someone who hasn't experienced some sort of trauma.
Just before we go here, so much to talk about, so many resources. What is the single most important thing you would leave this conversation with that would inform individuals and the humans that serve those individuals? You got a lot of listeners who are financial planners, who are investment professionals, all those sorts of things. What would one takeaway be for them?
Oh, that's a hard one to
I
answer.
know. I know it's
Yeah,
hard.
it's really hard. So much I'm experiencing a scarcity response in the one answer,
Right.
actually. Reduced cognitive capacity here. But we work with a lot with financial professionals, wealth advisors, et cetera. And the one thing I would say is that every behavior that is occurring around money that feels unhelpful, that's happening in a pattern, there much more layers to it than we might be considering. And just by naming it creates so much like spaciousness
Yeah,
and capacity for that client to actually move more towards their agency and empowerment,
it's great.
rather than them being like taking on this personal responsibility narrative that they failed because they
Yeah,
didn't, do the checklist well or whatever. Just like naming what's in the room creates a lot of space and
it's great.
gray.
Chantel, thank you for joining us today. We really
Thank
appreciate it.
you. Thanks.
Chantel Chapman is CEO and founder of the Trauma of Money Institute. You can find lots more resources online. Where this fits with the conversation that Moolala has been happening for almost a decade now is that there is a very clear link between knowledge and insight into your past and how that affects your present is so critical in getting a better handle on your money so you can live the life you want.